With Pokemon Scarlet and Violet only 3 months away from launch, I and many others are starting to think to ourselves, what do we want to see in this Pokemon game? How can it improve on the previous entries, and will it act as a big step into something new for the franchise? Whether you're hyped for the game or more skeptical, the reality is that Pokemon Scarlet and Violet will have major implications on the Pokemon formula moving forward, and today I want to discuss my top 5 hopes for these games, which I believe subsequently will benefit the mainline Pokemon franchise as a whole. Do note that this video will contain opinions about the mainline games in general and how I think they can be improved upon, so if you're prone to salt, you might want to click off. This is by no means a Pokemon sucks video, but we will be discussing some shortcomings that I believe have been present in Pokemon games and how I think Pokemon Scarlet and Violet can improve upon this if executed correctly. So with that being said, make sure to sit back, relax, and let's go over my top 5 hopes for Scarlet and Violet. Number 5, a longer campaign. So depending on how vast and full of content this open world will be, which is something we will be discussing in a bit, I'd like to see the main campaign of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet be longer than a typical Pokemon game. Pokemon games since their inception have always had much shorter campaigns than most console games in the same genre because up until recently they were handheld exclusive games, and especially at the beginning were much more reliant on space management. With Pokemon Sword and Shield being the first mainline Switch Pokemon games, a lot of people expected them to be much longer experiences. However, the games were pretty much campaign-wise akin to something that we had already been used to. I'd argue that Sword and Shield actually had less campaign content than previous installments, but the point I'm trying to make is the same. I think now that we're on consoles and games are pricier, that Pokemon can't really use the fact that it's a handheld to hold itself to a different standard than other RPGs. I think something like a 40-hour campaign should be the basis for Pokemon games moving forward. Again, this is lower on the list because the games are now going to be open world, and open world games can get away with having shorter campaigns if they have a lot of side content. Number 4, evolutions. Okay, so I would like to see some old Pokemon receive some love in Scarlet and Violet. Call me old-fashioned, but ever since Generation 5, with the exception of Eevee, the idea of cross-general evolutions have been scrapped, and I think that was a mistake. Gen 6 brought forth Mega Evolution, so I see why they didn't do evolutions there, and Gen 5 was a soft reboot, but I really think a lot of older Pokemon especially can benefit from receiving new evolutions. There are a ton of Pokemon that I think could warrant this, and I did in fact create a video going over my top 10 evolutions for Scarlet and Violet, so if that's something you're interested in, check it out, link below. Number 3, no more forced XP share. With Pokemon making the leap to having an open world game, one of the biggest pillars when it comes to open world and non-linearity is player choice, and this in my opinion should extend to the EXP share should they decide to bring it back, and affection if they decide to bring that back. In other games, having shared experience isn't inherently bad because most of these games either have difficulty options or the games are specifically scaled for that system, but at least in my opinion, the last few Pokemon games with the exception of Arceus had really bad EXP share issues and would typically just make you over level. Furthermore, a big issue with shared XP that is exclusive to Pokemon is the fact that knocking out enemy Pokemon duplicates the EVs received on your entire team. So basically, you'll have a team that consists of the same EV spread, and you have very little control over this. Some people have crafted some very creative ways to get around this, such as boxing your Pokemon and rotating them around, or even using 12 Pokemon instead of 6 and then swapping them in and out so the EXP doesn't get too ridiculous, but these are such convoluted ways to get around a system that literally just needs an on and off switch that was already present previously. I can't stress how easy it would be to code something in like that. If EXP share is on, share XP. If else, do the normal thing. It would only take a few lines of code, and if they're so worried about people not understanding how to work the EXP share, they could just have it under the option settings as default on, and then have you have the ability to go into the options and turn it off. I don't see why this isn't already a thing. Number 2, post-game content. Alright, so ever since X and Y, I have felt that most Pokemon games were sorely lacking in post-game content, and while some will argue that very early entries in the franchise suffer from this as well, the whole point is to try to improve over time. Yes, Gen 1 barely had any post-game, but then Gen 2 had a region. Then Gen 3 kicked it up with the Battle Frontier, a bunch of legends to find, contests, etc. Gen 4 was much of the same, with a little more. Gen 5 had unlockable parts of the region, and the Pokemon World Tournament. Then from Gen 6 on, all we really got was a Battle Tower clone, and in the recent gen, the only real post-game was a DLC. Now, a fair point is that a lot of the best post-games were present in the definitive versions of these games, but again, we're supposed to be improving the model, not taking steps back. It all honestly goes without saying that we should have some type of post-game content that acts in a similar way to something like the Battle Frontier, where you could spend a lot of time practicing with different teams and will give veteran players a challenge. I completely reject this idea that we can't have a more fun, challenging post game because kids these days are on their phone too much, or whatever Masuda said. Because we're talking about optional content here, not something that would have a major effect on the main game. Why not do something that would appeal to your veteran fans that make up a large portion of the Pokemon community? Number 1, fill up the world. Okay, so I have a little bit of a controversial opinion when it comes to open world games. I feel like everybody thinks that open world is just objectively better to linearity, and I do not believe that this is the case. Personally, and I'm sure a lot of you will disagree with me on this, when it comes to something like Breath of the Wild, where everybody was freaking out because it was this open world Zelda game, I found many aspects of it, especially with regards to the world, to just feel sort of repetitive and empty. A lot of shrines were, like I said, very repetitive. There weren't a whole lot of enemy types considering the massive scale of the world, and climbing was hell when it was raining. Not to mention the fact that the game lacked the same story depth as the more linear 3D Zelda titles like Twilight Princess or Wind Waker. But anyways, tangent aside, I'm not saying the game's bad. I actually did enjoy Breath of the Wild, but what I'm trying to say is that just being open world isn't what makes a game good. And a big part of making an open world game is making sure that there's a lot to do in that open space. If I'm running around the game and the only thing I get to do is find Pokemon, it's going to get old really quick. I really enjoyed Legends Arceus, but once I caught everything, I felt no need to go explore anywhere else, because other than catching Pokemon, there doesn't really feel like a lot of rewards for exploration. I want Pokemon Scarlet and Violet to have secret areas where you could find special items, a real side quest system, and all that fun stuff. If the main campaign isn't going to be super long, I do expect there to be a lot of side content to sort of break up your main quest. This would allow for a much more fulfilling experience. There's a lot they could do in terms of items and rewards for exploring too. A good example would be the fact that in recent times, all the legendary Pokemon are just thrown into some sort of dumpster, whether it be Ultra Space, the Mirage Islands, whatever they did in the Sword and Shield DLC, etc. How about instead this time they take advantage of this huge world they have to construct caves with puzzles for some of the legendaries, other areas that maybe require certain items to access that you can't get at first, and stuff like that. There are so many legendary Pokemon, they could easily have a bunch of mini dungeons, whether they be underground, hidden in a forest, on top of mountains, in the sky, whatever. They could even hide cosmetics for your character, battle items that usually you'd have to spend BP on or whatever, just to give you a more fulfilling exploration experience. I just really want this game to be worth investing a lot of time exploring, and I don't think it would be too hard to make that happen. But yeah, there you go, guys. Those are my top hopes for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. A lot of it just boils down to have some player choice and have content. I don't want the game to hold my hand, and I also don't want it to feel like a barren wasteland that's open world just to be open world. I think there's a lot of potential for this Pokemon game, and if Game Freak plays their cards right, we could really have a cool formula on our hands. But then again, only time will tell. That said, if you're a fan of monster taming games, including Pokemon, of course, definitely subscribe to my channel because I put out new monster taming videos every single day. You can check out my Twitter, my Discord, my Patreon, all links below. Special thanks to the patrons, especially Jim Hamilton, Droghost, and Dark Persona, and we'll see you guys next time. Peace.